Hey,
Hey, I like that backdrop.
thank you. Do you like my tech guy?
I love your tech guy.
Why can we not hear her?
Oh, you guys have your coffee nearby. Why didn't I think of that?
I'm sorry.
That's okay.
You think it's coffee.
Oh,
No, I'm kidding. It is. Hello, everyone, and thanks for joining us. I'm Catherine LaSota. I'm the founder and host of LIC Reading Series, and this is the very first episode in a new series that we're doing with Literary Hub Virtual Book Channel, where on the occasion of the 5-year anniversary of LIC Reading Series, I've been doing it 5 years. I almost know how to name my own series. We are doing a series of conversations with alumni of the series over the year, people who have not read together, but to come together as alumni of the series and read a little bit from each other's work and discuss each other's work. So today is the first episode, and I'm coming to you from my home in Queens, which also includes a 3-year-old and a baby and a husband. So you might hear that in the background. But today we have Bridgett M. Davis and Jason Tougaw. And Bridgett was with us at the series on May 8th, 2018.
Wow.
And Jason was with us on December 12th, 2017 and December 10th, 2019, because Jason really likes the month of December. So I just do super brief introductions for our two folks here. What we're going to do is have Jason read a short passage from Bridgett's work. And so Jason is a professor in the MFA program in creative writing and literary translation at Queens College, CUNY, and he hosts a weekly music show called The Mixtape on public radio station WJFF in Jeffersonville, New York. He's the author of The Elusive Brain, Literary Experiments in the Age of Neuroscience, and he recently completed a novel called Summer Isn't. His memoir, The One You Get, Portrait of a Family Organism, was published in 2017. And Bridgett M. Davis is professor of journalism and the writing professions at Baruch College, CUNY. She's the co-founder and curator for Words at Weeksville, which is a monthly reading series held at Weeksville Heritage Center in central Brooklyn. She's the author of 2 novels, Shifting Through Neutral and Into the Go-Slow. And her memoir, The World According to Fannie Davis, My Mother's Life in the Detroit Numbers, was published in January 2019. Guys, I'm so excited to have you here. We're going to kick things off with Jason reading a few pages from Bridgett Davis's book, The World According to Fannie Davis, which you can see over her shoulder, and I love it. All right, Jason, it's all
Yes,
you.
I have a different cover, but I'm very happy to be reading this. Thank you, Catherine, and thank you, Bridgett, because I love this book. So it's a total pleasure to be doing this right now. So I'm going to just launch in. On a frigid winter night, my mother showed up at her brother's home and banged on his door. Woke me up and everything, Uncle John recalls. She stepped inside and stood before him, not even bothering to take off her coat. I want to try to bank the numbers, she announced. She knew the allure of playing the numbers, and she also knew that real money could be made. All I need is $100 to get started, she told John. My mother was hoping that her big brother could loan her the money. He was an exercise boy for Detroit's racetrack, a gifted horseman who'd go on to become one of the first African-American horse trainers in the country. He'd been on his own since he was 14, working at racetracks, and in Detroit for several years longer than Fannie. His work was steady and he made a decent living. She explained it to me and everything, he recalls. She told him her plan was to start taking the neighborhood's penny bets, collecting coins from folks playing an array of 3-digit combinations for small amounts. She figured that modest money would add up over the weeks and months as long as no one hit. And if someone did hit, she'd have the $100 in reserve for payouts. Uncle John thought it made sense. I can make it with $100, she repeated. Do you have it? I said, yeah, Fannie, I got it. That same year, 1958, Berry Gordy borrowed $800 from his family's credit fund to launch Motown Records. With the loan money, she got started right away. Week after week, Mama took in those pennies and dimes and nickels and quarters from customers playing an array of combinations every day except Sunday. People could bet on the Detroit race or the Pontiac race. Each had 2 winning 3-digit numbers. Hence, Mama asking all her customers, you want this number played both races, Detroit and Pontiac? As she recorded the letters D and P beside their bets. Cutoff time was late afternoon, early evening. By dusk, first race digits hit the streets, and by dinner time, word had spread and everyone knew both sets of winning numbers in both races. The winning numbers came from 2 different sources. The Pontiac number came from actual racing forms, based on results from pre-selected racetracks, from the fairgrounds at New Orleans to Aqueduct in New York to Washington Park outside Chicago. And bettors could compute it themselves. All the racetrack payoffs for win, place, and show in the first 4 races were added up. The first number at the left of the decimal point became the first of the 3 winning digits. This process was repeated to get a total of the pari-mutuel winning payoffs for the first 5 races. And the number to the left of the decimal point became the second winning number. Okay. The process was carried out a 3rd time for the winning payoffs total in the first 6 races, again using the number to the left of the decimal. Those 3 tabulated digits became the first Pontiac winning number. Second 3-digit winner was compiled similarly. The winning digit for the first 6 races was always used as the first digit. The race payoffs for the 7th race were totaled, and the digit to the left of the decimal point became the second winning digit. This formula was repeated for the 8th race, and numbers operators had their second 3-digit winning number. On a given day, for example, 692 and 281, or 784 and 431 could be the winning numbers for Pontiac. Aunt Florence says Fannie could do those calculations herself, using the requisite daily racing form. And she had some access to those forms thanks to my Uncle John, given that he was a horseman at the local racetrack. When he was working the New Orleans track, he'd call long distance to give her the winning races, so she often knew the winning number before most. But like a lot of people, Florence didn't understand the formula. I never did figure out how they chose those numbers, she admits. I never did know how you did that shit. I love Aunt Florence. I'm definitely with her on that.
That was great. Thank you, Jason.
Yes, do you want me to just talk about how?
Yeah, talk about why you chose those passages from Bridget's book and how they spoke to you. And
well, I chose this passage for like many reasons. The first, I mean, it stood out to me partly because my grandfather was a jockey, so the horse racing connection just spoke to me, and also my grandfather got my grandmother's brother a job on the racetrack where he eventually became a horse trainer and was like an expert at like gaming the racing forms, you know. So it just felt like there was that cool connection. And there's always this kind of little bit of an outlaw thing around horse racing, or there was then. But in addition to that, I just think the writing here is amazing, because the way we get to know Fannie through her visit to her brother, and then like the ingenuity that we see in action with her developing this business, but also like her facility with this incredibly arcane feeling system that her sister doesn't understand, right? And she's like an expert in, and it's just, this is really a story about a woman who's so ingenious and so expert. And so it felt like that. And then there's another thing, that the presence of both John and Florence kind of speaks to something about this book that's really interesting, that it's like, when Bridgett, when you're describing how she developed the business. It's like you're getting the information through John, but you're describing it in your voice. And then Florence comes in, and there's definitely a thing where this is like a collective family story, and the voice is like imbued with all those characters from the family. And that's one of the things that I just think is absolutely beautiful about it, and a big reason I chose this passage.
Mute.
I'm unmuting myself now. Thank you so much, Jason. You read that quite beautifully, actually. It was wonderful to hear. Thank you for that. Yeah.
I was muted, but my pleasure.
We're all learning here. I am now officially unmuted.
Yes, and we can hear everybody. Jason, did you have any particular questions in reading that passage? I know it was, do you feel like you understood the system after reading through those couple?
No.
Not really, no. I mean, I'm not good at math, and I'm dyslexic. I think I would have been terrible at this. I think I would have to write it down to understand it. Like, I'd have to write it out. But I think I think it's cool that actually we don't need to understand it for it to work, to give us a sense of Fannie's mind. You know, like it's more about that. It's almost like my not understanding it kind of is the point. And like and it follows with Florence not understanding it. So that's my answer to that question. I guess my question for Bridgett is, well, I have two, I think. The first one is, it feels to me like you very much involved a lot of your family in the making of this book. And I'm just curious to know about how you thought about that and how it worked and how they thought about it.
That is such a great question, because it really cuts to the heart of what I was trying to do. It really is. Can I just say first that, do we ever tire as writers of hearing someone else talk about our work? It's such a beautiful experience, you know, just to both see what you got from it that wasn't necessarily my initial intention, or I'm more excited to see that what I was trying to do actually looks like I pulled it off, you know? So thank you for that. I always saw this as a need for me to tell a story that wasn't just about my feelings about my mother, because she was such a larger than life personality. And I knew that so many people felt strongly about her. And it felt important to use this experience as a kind of collective memory and a collective tribute. And I also knew that everyone else's voices would be so important to paint this portrait of her. You know, I wanted it to be a full portrait. And I also love the idea of going around and just collecting everyone's like memories. It was really, it's much more of a familial memoir for me than it is just how I felt and my experience with her, although that's at the heart of the book. So I spent several years actually interviewing family members and friends. I ended up doing about 24 interviews across a few years. I traveled around. I would interview, for instance, my Aunt Florence and my Uncle John repeatedly. Like, I'd interview them one year, and then I'd go back to Detroit 2 years later and interview them again. So that's why I was able to really get those stories. You know, I was very aware too of time, because my aunt and uncle were already up in age. And I kept feeling like no one knew my mom better from the perspective of a sibling. So I better capture these stories, you know? So a lot was going on in my head. And then I had to figure out how to make it compelling on the page. That was its own challenge. But
You definitely did that. I'm curious about the repeated interviews. What difference did it make to do multiple interviews with them?
It was really something I only learned in the process, that each time I went back, I found that one of two things would happen. for instance, with my Uncle John, he would tell the same story again. And that made me know that this was vital and resonant in his life. And also he would remember a new detail. And that told me, oh, every time I talk with Uncle John, he talks about Fannie showing up at his door.
Yeah.
You know? And so maybe the second or third time he tells it and he's enjoying the story, right? He'll say a new detail like, woke me up and everything. You know, maybe the first time he didn't say that. He's getting more comfortable with telling it, and his memory's coming back more. And then the other thing that happens is sometimes in the second, third, fourth time I talk with him, he tells me something he had never said before. One example very quickly is the last time I interviewed him, just offhandedly, he said, yeah, and Fannie used to sit up in that movie theater and wait for the number to come out because she was so nervous. She was worried about the winning number coming out and she'd get hit and she didn't have a lot of money. And so during those hours that she waited before the number was announced, she would sit up in a movie theater. And I realized, oh my gosh, she must have had me with her.
Oh, wow.
And that just took me down a path, a storytelling path. That one true anecdote gave me a chance to create, to really run with my own imagination. If I had stopped interviewing him after the second time, say, I would have never learned that detail. So that's what I came to understand, that the repetition was important.
Yeah, that's really interesting because what comes out is something that comes out just in little bits throughout the book. There's a thread about your mother's vulnerability, because the main thing about her character is she's larger than life and she's so strong and everybody respects her and maybe even is intimidated by her, right? But then there are these little moments of like, she knows she could be in trouble, right? She knows it's a little dangerous. She could lose money, like there is, but it's very under the surface. And she was really about taking care of people. So she didn't want to show that much, right?
Yeah, and I understood that I needed to go through my own process in telling this story and come to know her as a woman. Now that I was a woman, and I could see her beyond the role of my mom. And it was also key for me to hopefully make readers understand the risk, the real risk and the price paid. And if she was completely stoic throughout all of it, then that wasn't going to capture the reality of what she faced and what she accomplished. Right. In the face of that fear.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah. So.
Yeah. Speaking of that, there is also this really interesting tension in the book about the fact that you grew up learning to keep secrets, and now you're writing a book divulging those secrets, right? And kind of like how that simultaneous, like you're sort of like thinking of what that means about your mother's legacy. And you're very much honoring her, but you're also like breaking the rule of your childhood by doing it, right?
Terrifying. I literally am doing the things she said not to do. She said that no good could come from me running my mouth.
Right.
And to tell this story about her, I have to run my mouth. And that is what kept me from telling the story for decades, long after no one would have cared about, the fact that my mom ran numbers, the lottery was legal. It wasn't really a need to keep the secret literally. It was just my concern about, really sort of betraying her, until I came to realize that not telling people was a different kind of betrayal. That I was actually acting like I was embarrassed of her by not telling people. Right. So it flipped for me, but I had to get a lot of maturity and I had to really have some distance, from having held the secret. That's what I loved about your work. This idea of, children holding secrets, right? And what that does to us. And in my case, it didn't even seem like quote unquote dark secret. It wasn't. And yet a secret's a secret. And I was so with you, that little boy, just having to really keep double and triple secrets, your dream having to be a secret. I mean, we're going to talk about that in a moment, but then the details of your dysfunctional life that you felt, I have to understand this for myself, but I can't talk about it.
Yeah,
and I totally connected with that.
There's definitely some overlap there, because it was like, this is my idea was, this is unacceptable to the world, people in the world around me, right? They can't, and so I just have to hide it.
Right.
Yeah.
Both because maybe even if you weren't ashamed, for instance, right? You just knew how other people were going to judge you and your family, which is equally horrible.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it strikes me also there's a really interesting and subtle political dimension to your secret, and especially in ways that your mother kept up when the lottery became legal, and she kept devising new ways to keep people involved with the numbers. And it was really like an African-American community who didn't really want to give their money to the state. So if she came up with an alternative where they could circulate money within their community rather than giving it to the state, they were on board. But she had to really make sure that it was inviting enough,
Yeah, she had to really build that argument.
Yeah, right.
Because I think fundamentally my mother didn't believe the state deserved to win.
Yeah.
Well, I think a lot of us would agree with your mother right now.
Right? Exactly.
I love that we have two alumni talking to each other about each other's work when you've written memoirs about your family. So there's such a rich conversation we can have here. And I think that, Bridgett, you were bringing up such a nice transition to talking about Jason's work and the one you get. So I wonder if I could ask you to read a passage from the one you get, Portrait of a Family
It was hard
Organism.
to choose. I must say, I saw so much resonance and so many ways to connect with the themes that were moving through it. And at the same time, I'd never read anything like it. So I'm really grateful to you, Catherine, because had you not invited me to do this, I wouldn't have had the great pleasure of discovering Jason's work. So I'm grateful. I really am. I loved this memoir so much. So I am going to just jump in and read. I think the excerpt I chose is pretty explanatory. I don't think there's anything I have to really set up. So I'll just jump in. Of these early memories, the dream is particularly vivid, maybe because it was recurring, whereas real events happen only once. I'm skipping on a road made of pink ribbon, winding through outer space, in the body of the kid in Nanny's painting. My hair is long again, thin and green like hers. I skip along the ribbon at a clumsy glide, wearing the smock dress, purple in the painting, but green in the dream. I have her skinny legs and expressively still face. I'm fragile, but tenacious. I'm Christopher Robin. I'm the little prince. I'm skipping in pure, calm terror. I know I can't keep this up. It feels like my body might shatter into atoms and become floating debris. So I change my pace to a frantic run. The running is chaos and feels almost like spinning, but less graceful, more agitated, like I've lost my footing permanently. It's excruciating, but preferable to the calm terror of the skipping. I start to realize that I know what scares me. It's something like God, more remote than Satan, but no less powerful or frightening. An omnipresent but disembodied male figure somewhere in space. He has in his hands a large nuclear bomb and is planning to drop it on me. The force of the threat propels me. I can't shake it. I can't outrun it. All I can do is alternate between the skipping and running, hoping the combination will keep my fear from killing me before he can. Skip, run. The pink ribbon road has no surface, so I never feel it when my feet hit the ground. There is no ground. I skip for minutes at a time, then run, slow to a skip, and break out running. I will do this eternally, as long as sleep persists. Skip, run, skip, run, skip. I had this dream so often that the calm, pure terror became a permanent element in my life. I called it the dream feeling. It still sometimes seeps into waking life, but it did so regularly when I was a kid, at my mom's weddings, alone, skipping rocks at Lake Hodges, in a crowd at a dance in high school. It neutralized me each time. I couldn't tell anybody about the dream because telling brought up the dream feeling. Before I knew it, not telling became a way of life, a personality trait. I spent a lot of time around Nanny's painting. My comment about inheriting it was a running joke between us, but I never told her I needed to inherit the painting because it was a version of me I was afraid of. Of course, I had never heard of Sigmund Freud or Carl Jung, the most influential dream theorist of the 20th century. If I'd been a patient, and they were both fascinated by the minds of kids, they'd have coaxed the dream out of me. They would have put it under the microscope of their competing theories and diagnosed my terror. Freud and Jung disagreed about the nature of dreaming. Freud argued that dreams fulfill wishes repressed during waking life. Through dreams, he believed, the more primitive, socially uninhibited self makes its presence known. Jung agreed that dreams are expressions of the unconscious, but he argued that their function was more positive, that they compensate for psychological imbalances and create mental harmony. My dream did both. It put me continuously in touch with a father figure who terrified me, but it also took me outside time and place, which is what I wanted more than anything as a kid. The dream made me think about a father I wanted to pretend didn't exist, and it gave me a new place to live where I could battle his giant ghost. But there's more to it. Children dream differently than adults. And according to psychologist David Folks, dreaming is integral to development. Dreams help build minds and selves. According to Folks, children between 3 and 5 dream in isolated static images, and they report a lot of dreams involving animals and few about people. Between 7 and 9, a dream self develops, becoming a hinge for the images in the dream, and emotions become associated with these images. The images begin to form stories. After 9, the dream itself becomes active, and dreams become emotionally charged scenarios involving other people. I am sure I had this dream before 9, and I'm convinced that it changed very little over time. Still, I think Folks must be right when he argues that dreaming serves a cognitive function as opposed to Freud's psychological function or Jung's metaphysical function, that dreams help build our minds. If Folks is right, this kid in the dream was not just a product of my imagination. That kid gave me somebody new to be, somebody who could live in Nanny's painting and in outer space, while the rest of me lived in a string of tiny houses my mom was fixing up, houses where we might start over after the disaster that was Charlie, and then after the disasters that replaced him. Maybe someday you'll be able to put a kid like me in a scanner while he sleeps and reconstruct his neural connections, trace the origin of his dreams. In doing so, you would be seeing my response to Nanny's painting, my running away to her house, the fact that God in this dream is also Charlie, my absent father, threatening to steal me back, my decision to become mute about the dream, and anything else I felt. Could a researcher stand before this kid, white lab coat precisely pressed, and ask just the right questions? The ones that would get the kid to offer up his mind so his brain might be visible? Probably not, I guess. It's gorgeous.
You read that so beautifully, and it's very moving to me to hear it in your voice.
Thank you. I just was so touched. I mean, I loved it. I loved it for so many different reasons. I mean, just the idea of how you were able to capture that dream in such vivid detail, it made me wonder if you still have it, or as you were writing it, were you back in that dream? Something that clearly haunted you for so many of your formative years. So just to bring us into that dream was really incredibly powerful writing. I love that. You know, in my household, a child's dream was valued because the idea was, oh, children are more prophetic. And so their dreams are really powerful. And more specifically, my mom always would say, what did you dream last night? Because she wanted to look in her dream book. And if I dreamed of a white cloud, she could go to her dream book and see what that played for. So it had a very literal value, right? And hopefully a monetary one too. So I was just looking at the contrast between, you know, the idea that I came to understand that children had power and that their dreams were spiritually positive. And that in your case, when you talked about this dream, it's like, you know, this figure was like a God that wanted to really harm you, maybe kill you. I just couldn't imagine the weight of that trauma, right? So, I mean, it's essentially a recurring nightmare, literally.
Yeah.
So I guess I think what I really want to know is, what was more terrifying, the kid that you became in the dream, or the Jason that woke up and lived this really difficult life in this dysfunctional home?
Yeah, you know, I want to say that it's actually the movement between the two and the blurring of the two. And actually I think that comes up in your book too, because it's not just the dreams of children that can be, you can look up stuff that happens in life in the dream books, right? Right. So there's like this way in which there's a little blurring between life and the dreams.
Exactly.
And I think that I started to see my real world in terms of the dream. So this like scary God with the nuclear bomb felt present while I was awake, and that was what was terrifying. Yeah. And you know, I think it was because I was too young to really be able to respond to actual terrifying things happening around me. And that the people protecting me were both creating those things and vulnerable to them in ways that I just had no ability to do anything about, you know? Yeah.
Did it give you insomnia? Like, did you literally think, I don't want to go to sleep, I don't want to enter in that? Or was it in a strange way a safe space?
Yeah, it was in a strange way a safe space because it was controlled. Like I knew what happened in that dream. It happened the same way every time, you know? And then, and over time, and I had this correspondence to this amazing painting that my grandma had. So I could look at that painting and know that I had a private life, I guess, right? Wow. And that maybe I could protect my private life long enough to be out of the circumstances I was in. Yeah.
You were protective of that. It was yours.
Yeah.
even though it wasn't all positive.
Right.
I think like this line that you write based on, you know, the research you've done and sort of the way you've studied both science and psychology to really make sense of your own experience, I find so brave and beautiful and an education to all of us. Really, I felt like you did a lot of research on our behalf, you know.
Oh,
I love that when I was reading the book. But you say that dreams help build minds and selves, and that's a little bit of what you're describing now, right? And so it just makes me think, what self did that recurring dream help build in you? Like, if you look back on it
Yeah.
now.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you asked this question, do I still have the dream? I don't still have the dream, but I do have it as a daydream. So there is a way in which it became a part of me. One thing about that kid in the dream is there's like a gender ambiguity going on, right? And I think that that became a way of like honoring my sexuality, you know, came from partly the dream, and also the fact that the kid isn't killed, right? I mean, like the kid in the dream survives,
Right.
To make it to the next dream. And so I think you know, it was like, oh yeah, I can survive if I just keep doing this, I can make it, you know. I think in some ways I eventually had to get over that stuff because it was too much. Like, it was too much striving, like, you know, too much running. Like I need to just like pause and know that like I'm fine, you know. But earlier it definitely gave me a certain kind of drive. And I think ultimately a drive to write too. And something that overlaps with your family, which is just that a great thing about my family was this very huge enthusiasm for telling stories and repeating our family lore. Right. So I really identified with that in your book, among your family. And that's when my family had fun. And that's when it was great, you know? So there's a way in which like I just, that's part of my, you know, DNA is that family lore and those stories and the pleasure in it. So I could, becoming a writer, I could eventually kind of take the painful stuff and put it through the filter of the fun way that we shared those stories, you know.
Makes it manageable, makes it special.
Yeah.
Yeah, someone said to me the most obvious thing. She was like, you know, Bridgett, you had this secret. That's why you're a writer. You were always finding a way to tell. And I thought, you're right.
Yeah.
I wasn't telling the secret, but writing is telling.
Right.
So, and if you're made to squash something and keep it down, I guess there's just this human impulse to tell.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And it also, in my case, it was important to tell my version so that I wasn't, so many of the kids I grew up with just got lost in the chaos, you know, of just the ways that our parents and the adults around us were living.
Right.
And so, you know, I thought of myself as a writer pretty early on as a kid, and sort of taking ownership of the story was a way of like imagining a thriving life, you know? Yeah.
Yeah, and you too had really dynamic, you know, family members who were really big personalities with their own versions of these stories, right?
Absolutely.
So it's like we have to assert ourselves in that, you know, like make sure that their version doesn't become our way of seeing a reality we lived.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah, I do know what you mean. And then it's interesting to publish it, because then, you know, everybody in the family has a different version of what the story is.
Right.
And there's something great about that too, right? I don't have to be absolutely right. I'm sure my memory's wrong about many of these things, you know, but the act of doing my best to recount it as accurately as I could was very important to me. But then it's also really important to me to hear how they respond. And and tell me more stories related to the stuff that I wrote about. Yeah.
You almost feel like you can write a part 2 or an addendum, after something gets out in the world. I know I've found that, that people add on stories.
Absolutely. Yeah, there's a story in my book about being arrested shoplifting with 2 of my friends as teenagers. Right. And when the woman, who's now a woman, she was a girl then, who was involved in that, came to a reading in San Francisco that I did, and she was like, that's not how it happened. And so she told me this amazing thing, which is we were getting arrested by the security guards, and apparently as we were walking to their office, she was dumping out all this jewelry from her pockets into like the pockets of dresses that were on display in the store.
That's smart.
And was like doing this like kind of amazingly ingenious thing that I just had no memory of, or maybe ever didn't even notice, Right. And then just that version of the story is so great. I just want, I want that story to be told.
You're like, darn it, I wish I'd known. What a great detail, right?
Yeah.
Well, I've not really shared this anecdote, but my story opens, the prologue is about when I was in first grade and my teacher made me name all the shoes I had.
Oh, yeah. Mm-hmm.
And it always was so very clear to me that it was a racial dynamic, that this white teacher didn't think this little Black girl deserved to have more shoes than she had.
Yeah.
And she challenged me on it. And I'm in Detroit doing a reading, at the Detroit Public Library, my favorite place on earth. And it's packed, and people from my life are there, every aspect of my life. And I'm signing books, and this woman stands before me, and she's like, "You remember me?" I'm like, "Oh my God, Angela, we were in first grade together." And she said to me, she leaned in and she said, Miss Miller, that teacher, she has some color in her. I was like, "What?" She's like, "Yeah, her daughter was brown." So I thought, you're kidding me. So it was more complicated than I thought. She wasn't just this white teacher.
Right.
She was either mixed race, or she was a white teacher who had a child of color. So what does that mean? And how did that implicate her feelings toward me? But of course, the book was written by then, right?
Yeah.
But I felt just like you did.
Yeah. It's also the kind of thing you can never quite know what was motivating her. Maybe she didn't know,
Maybe she didn't know. Yeah. Yeah. But it's a complication that would never arise if you hadn't originally written the story.
Right. Absolutely. Right. Yeah. So you learned more about your life.
Yeah.
Just by the act of publishing it. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, that story also is a really great way to begin the book, because it shows your mother empowering you in such a kind of elegant and organic way. She just doesn't make a huge deal about it, but she just tells you what to do, and you go to school and you do it, and you're done. Right?
She never even said a word to that teacher.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Amazing.
Yeah.
You guys, I feel like we could have a part 2 of this conversation, because there's so much that's coming up about what you learned from writing a memoir. And are you learning about yourself or your family or the people who are reading it? And what are the other stories that come up? And I have so many questions about when it became the right time for you to tell these stories, and how they would be different now if you told them. But we're out of time. And that's okay. We're just going to leave everybody wanting a little bit more of the goodness that is both of your books in this time. And I very much encourage everybody to continue to support independent bookstores. Our long-running bookstore associated with the LIC Reading Series is Astoria Bookshop, and they do have a storefront on bookshop.org. Bookshop.org is great. Proceeds go to independent bookstores. So pick up The World According to Fannie Davis. Pick up the one you get. Continue the conversation in your own homes. And I want to thank Bridgett and Jason so much for being the first people to do this series for LIC Reading Series of Alumni Conversation. Thank you guys so much.
Thank you, Catherine. You have the coolest reading series. I think I told you that when I read It's so awesome. So just thank you for doing it and for continuing for 5 years and moving it forward. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. I always tell people the LIC Reading Series is the most fun you'll ever have reading.
Yeah,
And like, there's no pretension anywhere.
right.
It's just but tons of smarts.
Yeah.
So thank you, Catherine.
And you're a
Also, thank you,
natural host.
Bridgett. This was really fantastic.
This was great. I loved it. I could have kept talking. So.
Yeah, me too.
Maybe we'll do it again. All right. Thank you guys. Be well.
All right. You
All right.
too.
Thank you.
Be well.
Bye, guys.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Okay. You want to hear her? Go ahead, guys.
Say hello.
Say hello.
Hello.
There you go.
Now you
Thanks.
can't hear her.
I can also hear her.